Hello, lovely podcast people, and welcome to another episode of Not Another Nutrition Podcast. And this is part 3, hopefully the final part, I guess, of my kind of sugar podcast series. And I'm specifically, we've deviated a little bit away from sugar specifically, more into sugar addiction, and then to food addiction, whether or not that's a thing, eating addiction maybe as a better terminology, and into cravings. So this episode, I'm going to talk about cravings. And after podcast 2, I asked on my Instagram post just for people to submit some questions if they had any extras, once I knew this was going to be a multiple part series. And I got these questions. How can we actually reduce sugar cravings? Why is it so hard to not have sugar cravings? Why do they never disappear? Why do I always crave? I've actually annotated that one. I'm not going to read it out, but I wrote something quite blunt. I'm just going to talk to you about this stuff, because one of the other things is people are notoriously bad at being literal in their communication, which is really difficult, because if you're not literal, things get confused. And this is why people are often bad teachers, because they're not considered in their responses and in the words they use. This is a bit weird, actually. I feel a bit disconcerted. We're soon releasing the podcast on YouTube. So if you're listening to this one and you are one of those people who like to watch, then and you want to go back and listen to any episodes, I don't know why you would do that, but I know some people do listen to them more than once, and you want to watch, they're going to be on YouTube. Where was I? Yeah, I feel a bit disconcerted. Kind of my setup is a bit odd. Lucy kind of told me to move a bit forward, but I think she's talking rubbish. Maybe not. Anyway, sorry. So, I want to start by basically saying that the term food craving doesn't really have a valid definition. It's difficult to define. It's very well used colloquially and in the research, but it's not well defined. So please bear that in mind for one instance. Secondly, the point I was making just before, was that people are talking about, why do I have these sugar cravings? But one of the things I'm going to talk about in this episode is particularly chocolate cravings. There's a funny study about chocoholics, and a few different studies. There's one, I think I might have mentioned it last episode, and I probably didn't go into many details about they deprived people of chocolate or vanilla, which was just funny. I don't know. There was reasoning behind their methods, which I won't bore you with. Anyway, so people go, why do I get sugar cravings, and then talk about chocolate? Well, you're not craving sugar. You're either craving chocolate or you're craving highly palatable, high sugar, high fat foods that taste amazing, that have been designed to taste to make you want more. I don't know why my mind's gone somewhere with that. Designing the taste of something so people want more of it. Anyway, where was I? So, where to start with this? I think where I want to start with it is I want to be really practical, right? Why do I crave? Just reading these questions. How do we actually reduce sugar cravings or any cravings? Why is it so hard not to crave? So there's a few things to unpack here. The first thing I want to unpack is there will be different reasons for different people. Physiological or psychological environmental cues, etc., etc. So I never want to be reductionist. I never want to oversimplify complex issues. And I want to try and at least unpack a few things, because one of the things that I scribbled down was going back to this individual differences thing. And I want my podcast to be something that empowers people rather than confuses them or gives them one answer. And unfortunately, my podcast therefore won't be useful and won't go viral, because most people, in my opinion, I guess, are lazy. But as humans, we are somewhat designed to take the easiest path. And it's unfortunate, because often the easiest path just leads to no answers or no progress. So anyway, hopefully people, and often this is why in my career actually as a practitioner, very often by the time I worked with someone, they had messed themselves up so much that it just made everything a million times more difficult, because they had gone off and tried to do things themselves, or they had gone and seen a stupid personal trainer in London who was using skin fold calipers to assess their hormones and give them herbs, and I mean, it's not even a simplistic method, but it is a one size fits all. If you pay me this much money, I will give you the ultimate plan of herbs and dietary patterns and exercise, and it screwed them. Anyway, where was I before I went on a rant about these scumbags? So, why do we crave? What are we craving? So there's a few things. In the fitness industry, just going to mute. In the fitness industry, there is also an issue with people being obsessed with looking a certain way. And I'm not saying that as a negative thing or a judgmental thing to them. I like to look a certain way. But often at the expense of other things. And this is one of the issues. If you move your body far enough away from what we term our set point or our settling point, where your body naturally likes to sit, your body is going to try to regulate that. So we know this term homeostasis. And it tries to keep things the same. And one of the ways it will do that is to increase hunger. And that's where I want to start some of this, is some people, and I'm kind of going this, why do I always crave? And I wrote, because you always restrict or you are always hungry. Okay, so two different things. And there's something that I'm going to say here, which I'm probably going to put on some kind of quote at some point, is restriction is not hunger, and hunger is not restriction. Restricting foods doesn't equal hunger. These are two very disparate things. And people not as clever as me, yeah, I said it, people not as critically minded as me, people who just say things without thinking or without considering things, will often talk about a set number of calories or a set amount of restriction, and talk about how hunger is this linear thing, this linear entity. Restrict more equals more hunger. And they just never bother looking at the literature or listening to me properly. And even when they do listen to me, they don't then let that sink in when they talk about different diets or their diets or whatever. You know, I talk about this rapid fat loss protocols, this aggressive dieting, these very low calorie diets, not as something that's mine, that's in the clinical literature. And what we see is this reduction in hunger in the majority of people. So I want to start with that, of saying, And likewise, flip the types of individuals I'm talking about there with then the anti-diet movement people who think that anyone who restricts equals this is the outcome. Now, hunger is something we probably mostly want to steer clear of to a lesser or greater extent. There will be times that you are hungry. The problem is then fighting that hunger is an issue, or can lead to issues. But restriction is something totally different. Restriction, I've mentioned this just super interesting bread study previously, where they don't make people more hungry. They don't, the type of restriction is not a greater calorie deficit. The type of restriction is not even a macronutrient ratio. It is simply the instruction to do not eat bread. You can eat cookies, you can eat cakes, you can eat ice cream, you can eat chocolate, but you cannot eat bread. And people feel restricted and their adherence is lower. They drop out of the studies when you tell them, that's all you tell them. You can't eat bread in this study. And you're both on a fat loss diet, we're going to put you in a calorie deficit. And certain people just can't stick to it. And this is the same thing of these deprivation studies, this idea of you cannot have XYZ. We're going to remove chocolate, or we're going to remove vanilla, or whatever. So I don't know where to go in terms of what the right order of this is, but we'll stick with restriction. No, I'm going to go with hunger, okay? Because that's a simple thing. There's two elements to hunger. One is that if you are trying to maintain a physique or a look, and to be honest, it's complex, isn't it, when you bother to think deeply about this stuff. And this is something I spoke about on my tour a lot. And some of this will help with self-acceptance in some people. And it might actually be difficult for some of you to hear. Some of you as practitioners, personal trainers, need to hear this so that you stop being a gimp to your clients. And some of you need to hear this to understand your situation and to understand the cards that you were dealt at birth, in your teens, whatever, may have changed. And this set of cards that you're now playing are different. And you need to know what set of cards you're playing with to understand how to best play your hand. I hope that analogy makes sense to you. Because what I'm saying here is your genetics don't change completely over your lifetime, but things will change with regards to your physiology, your metabolism, etc. And I do plan to record maybe even a series on metabolism because there is a lot of misunderstanding on it. So what I'm saying here is if you are someone like me, for instance, naturally lean. Again, a big thing that people, the word privilege and all these social justice warrior idiots that exist in the world that ruin words and ruin movements. Don't stay on topic, Martin, stay on topic. But privilege, I understand my privilege. I understand that I'm in a privileged position in our society where I have a small appetite. And when I overeat, my body reduces my appetite so that I don't. And people thinking, oh, weight loss and fat loss and the way you look is all about willpower. And it's just, if you're someone who just digs deep and grinds, X, Y, Z will happen. No. That isn't the case. It is not a level playing field. Genetics exist, and they are hugely powerful. In fact, I even made a little note about a really interesting functional magnetic resonance imaging study that looked at some individual differences. Oh, I didn't actually write the author's name. Bad from me. I just made a little note to myself about genetically more able to resist consumption of high-calorie foods. Again, I'm going to start putting all of more references on my website for each podcast episode. So, on the website, martin-macdonald.com/NANP for Not Another Nutrition Podcast. That has all the episodes, and then you can click into those episodes, and I will put some of these references because I know some of you are geeky and like to go and read these things. And if there's ever anything else that I put there, interesting articles or links to other podcasts or anything, I'll put it there so it's a nice place for reference. Anyway, so I will put that study link up there. Hopefully. Anyway, so going back to hunger. Someone like me, I can then forcibly reduce my body fat, body weight down, and I will move, if you consider where I am now, and then I'm an elastic band, and you pull that elastic band, hold an elastic band between your two hands. If you're walking along doing some cardio and outside, walk along the street, put your hands out in front of you as though you're holding an elastic band. Right hand holding the right hand, left hand holding the left hand. Keep your right hand where it is and pull the elastic band with your left hand away from your right hand. That is a good analogy for your body moving away from its set point. And what happens as you pull the body away from the set point? The tension increases and the drive to go back to where it was increases. Interestingly, sometimes I use this same analogy with regards to diets. It's not how fast I move that rubber band away. If you don't know this, go and get a rubber band. See how far the rubber band fires. When you pull it slowly to the same point or quickly to the same point, it will end up in the same place, roughly. The reason being is it's how far you've pulled it away from that point. That changes your physiology. There are adaptations within your metabolism. Your hunger increases. Your metabolism slows. Both of those things. Your reward for food maybe changes. Those things. Your unconscious movement around the place and your fidgeting goes down to try and bring yourself back to your settling point. So, hunger, me, dieting down, getting leaner, that drive increases. Now put someone who naturally, for whatever reason, is sitting at a higher body weight. Now, I'm not saying that people can't ever get back down to their original weight, but it does become harder to varying degrees based on the individual. That's something I'm going to talk about in this metabolism podcast. And I'm labouring this a bit too much. My point is someone who has a much higher body fat percentage than me naturally will call it. They've been driven there. When I don't pay attention to my food, I will naturally sit in and around a figure. Someone else will naturally sit with a higher percentage body fat in and around a figure, right? When we're putting roughly the same amount of effort and giving as much attention to the way we eat and the way we exercise, I can not pay any attention to my diet, eat completely ad libitum, succumb to all of my hedonic desires, and not be the same body fat percentage as someone else. Hopefully you understand. It's a very, very, very basic premise, but see, people seem to forget that when discussions come to whether, when they basically put fat loss down as a purely willpower related thing. So bearing that in mind, the reason I started talking to you about this is I was talking about someone wanting to look a certain way. Now, for some people, they still don't look the way they want to look, but they still have the same increase in hunger and therefore the impacts this has on the brain. that someone who's looking super lean. Whereas me getting super, super lean and gaining some body fat, how I look back to how I look now, I won't get the same judgment, the societal judgment. I won't have necessarily the same feelings of failure as someone who is a higher percentage body fat who wants to lose weight and then regains it back to where they are. We both have had this same willpower, they're both same morality, they're both amount of grind or not grind or giving up or not giving up, but they got more judged because I went from 16% body fat to 10% and back to 16, and they went from 30 down to 22 and back to 30, for instance. So bear that in mind. So hunger increases to varying degrees based on the individual with weight/fat loss. Second of all, calorie restriction. When we diet, hunger will increase to varying degrees, and we have this non-linear curve. It might be that we have a U-shaped curve where the amount of calorie deficit, as it increases, our hunger maybe increases to some extent, and then at a point it almost has a drop-off. Maybe it's not a U, it's like a catastrophe theory falling off the cliff, as in hunger just goes boom. You know, my calorie deficit is 500, I'm hungry. 1,000, I'm more hungry. 1,500, I'm really hungry. 2,000, bam, no hunger. As I've discussed many a time in previous podcasts, if you've not listened to them. So bearing that in mind, hunger is not restriction. Restriction is not hunger. And when we come onto this topic of cravings, this is important. Because when we are hungry, again, let's talk a bit more about acute hunger in a daily environment. This is why when we get people discussing people with disordered eatings, binge eating tendencies, we maybe want to, and the problem is they make these absolute things. Everyone should eat a very regular meal pattern and no one should ever skip meals and blah, blah, blah. And it's just polarizing statements because we know they're wrong about 100% of the population. You know, they're not talking about 100% of the population. They're only talking about a small percentage of the population. But they are correct that maybe people who are having these binge tendencies need to... Sorry, I just need to turn off my heater. Alexa, I'm hot. Yes, I am. Good, huh? Little routine. I say I'm hot. She changes the thermostat down to... And my heating's gone off. I also had an extra heater because it was cool in here. Sorry. Back on topic. These individuals who have these binge tendencies, we probably want to keep them away from getting starving hungry or even too hungry, even to the point where we might recommend that they eat on a regular schedule and to try and get them to eat before they get hungry. And one of the reasons this is we have this almost disparate... Do you want to know what that means? Alexa, what is the definition of disparate?
Disparity is usually defined as lack of similarity or equality, inequality, difference.
So, this disparate increase in how much we want junk food versus just food in general. Again, I'll link to some of the studies that talk about this. They're quite complex studies. Lots of discussion of the amygdala and prefrontal cortex and all these different areas, hypothalamus in the brain. But what we understand is that when we get really hungry or we're fasted or these kind of things, when we look at food, junk food or less high calorie food, and actually they also compare it to like looking at cars and planes and stuff like that, scenery, landscapes, we get this massive increase in desire to eat and activation of these centers where we're anticipating the pleasure. So it's not just that we get hungry and actually our overall desire to eat goes up. It's actually a disparate increase in wanting of high calorie dense, junky foods, donuts, this, that, and the other. So we maybe want to stay away from hunger in that way as well. Hunger will increase these cravings, these feelings of whatever you might deem to be craving. So you've got two things: a chronic increase because you are keeping your body fat low, or a transient acute craving because you're just hungry. So there's two things. Fast forward to restriction. And this is what a lot of the industry and people need to get more clued up on, is this craving. It's not this, I'm addicted, I need it, I crave it. It's not the same. And unfortunately, there's lots of issues because we compare foods and sugar and whatever, chocolate, to things like alcohol, and there's very different things going on with these substances, how they affect our physiology, the kind of dependency they create, and again going towards like opiates and drugs like that, when people are comparing sugar to cocaine or junk foods to cocaine and stuff like that. So, and there's this good paper, who is it? Polivy, someone like that. I'll link that one for you when I find it. That was really cool because they go into this and they talk about this circular logic, where essentially you go, and there's so much circular logic in lots of nutritional aspects. Lots of the anti-diet gimps again have this. Do they use circular logic? Maybe I'm more thinking about people like Fung in fasting and keto gimps, where they essentially talk about theirs is a more circular logic with regards to insulin resistance and carbohydrates. And anyway, I'm not going to go into that. This circular logic is essentially, cravings are often defined or studied from the aspect of we basically infer that someone craves a food when they eat a lot of it. Okay, so just think about that. You eat a lot of that food, therefore you crave it a lot. I'm not saying that's the case. That's what is used as one of our methods. And then we infer cravings based on consumption, and then we base consumption on cravings. And so we do both things at the same time. And so therefore that's what's called circular logic. So we're saying this person must crave this food because they eat a lot of that food. And they eat a lot of that food because they crave it. It doesn't work. It's circular logic. If you put something like that into an Excel spreadsheet, it says you have got a circular logic, something or other. Do you want to? I don't know. Anyway, so cravings, it's a big issue. You, by not eating the foods, and so what I want to talk to you about is then we go into this physiological versus psychological aspect in the cravings world. Remember that this thing, your perception of restriction dictates its impact. Your mind is so powerful. Please don't think you're clever enough to outsmart your mind. You're not. You're an idiot. Your brain and psychology and whatever has evolved over these millions of years, and you're not going to just tell yourself, no, I can eat chocolate, but deep down, you're not letting yourself, etc. So remember I mentioned last podcast about this eat and be merry because tomorrow we diet. Just being told that you're going to have to diet tomorrow initiates this craving, this wanting to eat more, right? It's all in your mind. You haven't even started restricting, and it's already having an impact. And that impact is greater in people who have a history of dieting and this, that, and the other. And so how do you get away from chocolate and junk food and sugar cravings? Don't be hungry. Don't judge yourself for eating them, and just flipping eat them. I would not say I crave sugary foods, but I am a complete sweetaholic. I will, like in the Chocoholic study, I think the average intake was 12 60-gram chocolate bars a week. I mean, that doesn't seem like loads to me. I would maybe eat one a week, but I'll regularly eat 160 grams of squashies a day, a bag a day, minimum. I don't call myself addicted to sugar, because I just eat them. I'm not a high restraint eater. And I think this is the big thing that comes up in all the research that people need to understand, is high restraint eaters, people who restrict themselves, they tend to have higher BMIs, for instance, but then it becomes this chicken and egg scenario in many of these cases. And lots of the intuitive eating crowd will use this, and I don't know if they do it intentionally or they're just not intelligent enough to understand what they're doing. But basically saying that, the intuitive eating scale in and of itself is literally testing only what it wants to in its scale. So it's like, people who eat more intuitively have lower BMIs. Basically saying if you calorie count, your BMI will go up. But they don't have any causation within there. I am an intuitive eater. As in, I would score well on the intuitive eating thing. I never count calories. I listen to my hunger cues, blah, blah, blah. But I'm naturally lean, so I don't have to do those things. And I don't have to overly look at my nutrition to be the way that, say, society tells me I should be. If I start calorie counting, my BMI is not going to go up unless I want it to. But people who have more obsession towards food are maybe that way because they know that food affects their body weight or their body shape, etc. So we have these chicken and egg scenarios. But one key thing when people have disordered eating patterns, and one of the reasons I like things, the psychological aspects, the compassionate therapy, therapeutical things, like intuitive eating when it's not done in this dogmatic approach, is just stopping people dieting. How can you stop craving? Stop dieting. Stop restricting. Stop suppressing your body weight. Stop demonizing foods. But one thing that may help you initially is just to eat the food that you're craving all the time. And you might want to exercise some moderation within that initially if you don't want to fully let go, and that's absolutely okay. Sometimes people go, it's like take the reins off and just go mad. Likewise, people do that and have had success with it. But you might not feel comfortable that way. You might just want to go, I'm going to eat X amount of chocolate every single day. And it's counted. And you can feel some sense of control in that. And you can see that it doesn't cause your weight to spike massively or whatever. You can do this with bread. You can do this with sweets. Do it with whatever, for instance. And essentially, you disempower the food. By doing so, you have it every single day. Often people turn to that food to cope with something, stress or whatever, bad day at work, fight with their partner, and they binge. Well, if you have it every single day because it's their naughty food, so they reward themselves with that food, and getting out of that mindset can be hugely helpful for some. And some of this stuff is ingrained from being as a child. I should maybe talk about that a bit more, about rewarding or comforting too often with junk food. It's very, very easy when you've got a child that you love unconditionally, crying and crying and crying, and you're so sad for them. And you just say, "Oh, look, do you want some of this chocolate? Do you want some of your favourite sweets?" And then you just do it every single time. You can create some behaviours and some psychological patterns. So this is my practical recommendation, is to start doing the opposite of what maybe you think. And I also just want to mention that as if we call ourselves this evolutionary being, we probably have evolved to seek out these high calorie foods, or not probably, almost certainly this is shown in the literature. And it's an advantage as someone in the animal kingdom. And unfortunately, we now have a situation where we no longer have any food scarcity in the Western world, for instance. So seeking out those foods is really an advantage, being able to do that, and our body being able to remember the dopamine hit that we get from them. I think I mentioned the gut-brain axis in the last podcast, where we now understand that having these foods and the gut talking to the brain and the dopamine release and giving it, we can learn that pathway, and we can learn what foods gave us that hit so that we can seek them out, and next time we can then have this memory for that dopamine release. So there is an element of different people will need to take different paths. Maybe for some people it's eating those foods every single day to disempower them, but then bearing in mind that maybe some of the cravings, you have this memory. So every time you see that food, and you will never be able to get yourself away from that food completely, and you may know it's always there and this, that and the other, and therefore you want to eat a more healthful diet, and you don't want to eat a bag of squashies every single day. So you purposefully start just not buying them on some days, and you maybe do have a period where you feel like them, but you just go, I'm going to have something else. And over time, this is almost like an ivory tower discussion, or a utopian discussion of, you get to the point of empowerment, and you get to a point where you're not demonize the food, you're not a really, really restrained eater, and you're not, pushing your body weight down, X, Y, Z. And then actually, it's this whole idea of going to live on an island, and you haven't got access to that food, and therefore your perception isn't that you're restricting yourself, it's just it's not there, and you forget how rewarding donuts or squashies or whatever were. And it will reduce your cravings for them over time. But simply going every time you go to the supermarket, I'm not buying chocolate, and I'm not having that chocolate, and I see it there and I really want it, isn't the way forward to stop cravings. Okay. I wonder if there's anything else I need to talk about. I made a couple of notes. Oh yeah, the one other note I mentioned, one other note I made was this one study that cropped into my mind just because it's like a chocolate study. Eat chocolate and lose weight were the headlines. And the research group is a really, really good research group. I can't remember it begins with J, but I can't say. I think it's a woman, Jabakowitz or something. Anyway, you'll know it, those of you who are Kino geeks. And lots of the stuff I talked about like it's timed eating. And again, I'll link this study because it is a cool one. And lots of people in the kind of circadian rhythm, or chrononutrition world, and this group has done some good research in that area, but they'll use this study to say, yep, earlier eating is better for fat loss. But they don't really look at what these researchers were discussing, and some of the intimate parts of the methodology, in that it's a isocaloric study groups, both in a calorie deficit, and it's basically large meals in the earlier part of the day and then smaller in the later, and then vice versa. But the difference, or maybe this particular study, I'm trying to remember what year it was, quite recent, in the last few years. I'm thinking of the 2013 study, I think, which is different, which isn't exactly the same as this. So it might actually be just a calorie deficit and maybe more spaced meals. The key thing about the large breakfast study is they were like high protein, high carbohydrate breakfast with dessert foods. So the whole thing was like eat chocolate cake at breakfast and lose more weight. Now this study, I think they did a weight loss period of about, I want to say 16 weeks. It might have been 12. Roughly 3 or 4 months. But then they did this follow-up for 32 weeks, I can remember specifically. So what's that? Roughly 8 months, right? So it's a year-long study. But in the short term in this study, they didn't really see any differences in that weight loss period. So people going, and I'm not saying this isn't the case, because there are some interesting things about chrononutrition and maybe slight differences. Similar with sleep. You might get slight differences in body composition at the end of a diet. Certainly if you massively sleep restrict and you go on a fat loss period, the majority of subjects will lose slightly more lean body mass during that calorie deficit phase. So yeah, there's small differences, but lack of sleep isn't causing weight loss to stop, which is what some people take it to mean. And again, so there aren't these big differences. The difference is then I think in the follow-up period, the group which had these large breakfasts and was having cake for breakfast continued to lose more body fat. Quite a lot. I can't remember off the top of my head, let's say like 10 plus pounds in not loads, but a significant amount, 10 to 12 pounds in the following 32 weeks. But the other group put on, and I'm sure it was 20 plus pounds back on. So they end up like 30 pounds different at the end of the study. So it's like, look, if you eat a large breakfast, you will lose. But if you actually read the researchers talking about, they talk about these psychological cravings. So one group is told, eat that junk food that you love first thing in the day. Don't restrict yourself. And they get these hugely disparate results between the two groups with, what's seemingly a relatively small difference when you see that the calories that they're told to eat are the same. So it's interesting, right? Oh, Alexa, stop. It's telling me to go pick up the babies from school. What perfect timing. What an absolute gem. I don't know how long I've spoken for. Much longer than I expected, actually, because I did not think I'd be hearing that timer. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. All the references and studies, I will get them on my website. And one thing actually I wanted, so again, I was going to talk a bit about individual differences, wasn't I? But people are different. I'm not going to talk about that too much. I do want to talk about artificial sweeteners. Someone asked, is sugar as satiating as protein and fat? Protein we know is way more satiating than all other things. Sugar is not overly satiating. So maybe within the discussions around artificial sweeteners, I can talk about sugar-sweetened beverages because they are an interesting entity and something that would be interesting for us to discuss perhaps. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this. Thank you very much to those of you who have reviewed the podcast on iTunes. I really appreciate that. Please also, if you're not one of these people who clicks the subscribe button within the iTunes app or the iTunes website, I'm told that really helps the podcast with regards to the ratings, because they don't tell you how many subscribers you have. But I'm told that helps iTunes know if people are really interested in, because it might just be you get different listeners each time. But if you have subscribers, it says you're good. So please, even if you've just got even a partner, if you want to do me a real favor, give me a birthday present this year. Like people have donation buttons, Patreon buttons to give money. I don't want your money, but I would just really love the podcast to get out there more and more. I saw recently it was rated 5th in, I think it was the nutrition category in Great Britain, or maybe it was in America, or I don't know. Anyway, it was quite cool seeing it that high up for something that's relatively new. And Anyway, I really appreciate that. I'd love it if you left a review on iTunes, etc. And as always, please feel free to interact with me on my Facebook or Instagram posts about each episode. If you want to give feedback, ask more questions, clarifications, anything. Right, until next time, much love.